Imagine this. You wake up in the middle of a gray morning. Not the kind that signals a storm, nor the kind that invites you back under warm blankets. Just gray. Stale. The kind of morning that feels like it forgot to bring a reason with it. The alarm has long gone silent. Your phone is lighting up with reminders, deadlines, responsibilities, people waiting. You know exactly what needs to be done. Yet you lie there, unmoved. Not because you're tired, not because you're defiant, but because you feel nothing. A strange fog sits behind your ribs, quiet, heavy, shapeless. You finally sit up, not out of motivation, but obligation. You brush your teeth without looking in the mirror. You make coffee not because you want to enjoy it, but because it's part of the loop. Tasks get checked, maybe. Emails get skimmed. Conversations happen in autopilot, and yet at the end of it all, a cold whisper gnaws at your conscience. You're lazy. It's not a voice from outside. No one called you that, but it lives inside you like a parasite, judging, whispering, accusing. And the worst part? You believe it. But what if that judgment was wrong? What if it's not laziness at all, but something far more elusive, far more terrifying, and far more common? Because here's the paradox. You are not lazy. You're surviving a life that no longer has a north. You're swimming without a shore, running without a finish line, performing tasks that feel disconnected from anything real. You're not resisting effort. You're resisting meaninglessness. Laziness implies apathy, but what you feel isn't apathy. It's confusion, disguised as stillness. It's exhaustion from pretending to be okay in a world that never asked what you actually need. It's a soul that can't find a thread worth pulling anymore. If a ship spins in circles, is it because the engine failed, or because it was never given a destination? If a traveler stops walking, is it sloth, or has the path grown invisible beneath their feet? Here's the cruel trick. Society has taught you to measure your worth by movement, by hustle, by outcome. If you slow down, if you question, if you falter, you're labeled lazy, undisciplined, a failure of will. But what if the stillness isn't a flaw? What if it's a signal? What if what you call procrastination is really a subconscious protest against a life that no longer fits? What if your lack of drive is actually grief for dreams you were never allowed to name? And what if, just what if, your paralysis is not because you're weak, but because the direction you're being pulled in isn't yours at all? Here's a harder question. When was the last time you felt moved? Not by fear, not by deadlines, not by social pressure, but by something so meaningful that it made you forget to check the clock? Do you even remember? Or have you been navigating a life built on the scaffolding of shoulds? You should be productive. You should be grateful. You should be achieving more by now. You shouldn't feel this way. But here's the problem. When you build a life on shoulds, it may keep you moving, but it won't keep you alive. So ask yourself, with unflinching honesty, what if you're not lazy? What if you're just lost? Lost in an identity you never chose. Lost in a system that profits off your confusion. Lost in a story where you play a role but never wrote the script. This is where it begins. Not with shame, not with hustle, but with seeing. Noticing the fog. Naming the silence. Acknowledging that beneath your stillness lives a soul that is starving for direction, not discipline. And maybe, just maybe, the most dangerous lie you ever believed was that you were the problem. In the next chapter, we'll uncover what that problem really is. And it's not you. It never was. It didn't start with laziness. It started with disorientation. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, you were handed a map, not a real one, a metaphorical one, stitched together from parental expectations, academic milestones, societal norms, cultural definitions of success. It told you what to chase, who to become, what would make you worthy. Get the grades, get the degree, get the job, be agreeable, be consistent, be useful. But no one ever asked where you were actually trying to go. You must see that the systems you live in are not neutral. They reward obedience, not awakening. They monetize your confusion, commodify your worth, and label your despair as laziness to keep you manageable. The real enemy here isn't your willpower. It's the lie that your value is determined by your ability to function in a broken system. So the next time you sit in silence, unable to move, remember that stillness is not laziness. It is a protest. It is the wisdom of your inner self refusing to march toward a life that doesn't nourish it. And the question is not, how do I become more productive? The question is, what am I being productive for? And even deeper, who defined that goal for me? Now you begin to see the outline of the real problem. Not laziness, but a lostness so profound it was mistaken for failure. And that begs the next great question. What happens when you continue down this path unaware? Because this isn't just about your mornings or your to-do list or your motivation. It's about what gets buried in you, day by day, when you forget who you are and what you truly need. And if you don't name it soon, this hidden fracture, it will shape your life in ways you can't yet see. Let's go there next. And the map, for all its polished lines and bold destinations, was drawn by people who didn't know your landscape. It doesn't trace your internal terrain, your griefs, your gifts, your curiosities, your contradictions. It only plots the cities everyone else said were important: status, security, reputation, appearance. You were taught to chase goals before you understood values, to build a career before finding your voice, to obey rules before questioning who benefits from them. And so, somewhere deep inside, your psyche split. One part of you performed, well, even. You did what was expected. You followed the map. But another part of you, the deeper, truer part, fell silent. Not out of weakness, but out of disconnection. Because that map never took you home. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." But what if you're not avoiding your soul? What if you just never had the tools or permission to meet it? Psychologically, what we call laziness is often the product of two warring forces: the external self who performs, and the internal self who longs. The performing self works to maintain identity, image, survival. The longing self hungers for authenticity, for alignment, for purpose. When these two selves fall out of sync, motivation collapses. You might feel it as boredom, indifference, numbness, or even fatigue. But beneath it all, it's the tension of being alive, but unrooted. This is what Viktor Frankl meant when he described the existential vacuum, a sense of inner emptiness that arises when life loses its personal meaning. He saw it not as a moral failing, but as a spiritual crisis. And in that vacuum, one doesn't become lazy. One becomes adrift. Here's the terrifying beauty of the human condition. We are creatures of meaning. We cannot bear motion without direction, nor effort without significance. Even our suffering demands a reason. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But what happens when your life is full of how, but void of why? That's where the lie of laziness thrives. It fills the silence left by a missing why with accusation. You must be the problem. Try harder. And so, like a machine overheating, you push. You guilt-trip yourself into motion. You shame yourself into action. You hustle, self-optimize, drink more coffee, download more apps. But nothing sticks, because the core wound remains untouched. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre believed that when we live inauthentically, when we conform to roles instead of creating meaning, we enter a state he called bad faith. We act as if we have no choice. As if our jobs, our routines, our masks are the only reality. We become passengers in our own lives, rather than authors. And that is the hidden root of your so-called laziness. You were never lazy. You were alienated. Alienated from your inner compass. Alienated from meaningful work. Alienated from a world that measures value in output, not alignment. This alienation is not just emotional, it's existential. You were built for something more than repeating tasks that don't touch your soul. But how would you know that, in a society where rest is sin and doubt is weakness? Arthur Schopenhauer once observed that the deeper truth of human life is suffering, but not all suffering is equal. There is suffering with meaning, which refines, and there is suffering without meaning, which rots. Most modern burnout is not due to overwork. It is the slow decay caused by meaningless toil. You weren't meant to survive like this. You were meant to feel the pulse of purpose in your chest. To rise not because you should, but because you want to. To engage with the world from your core, not just your calendar. But to return to that core, you must first recognize the architecture of the trap. You think nothing's happening. You sit in bed for a few extra hours. You delay a project for another day. You leave texts unread. You feel a dull ache of disappointment in yourself, and then you move on. No explosion, no collapse, just silence, just routine, just one more lost hour, then another. But something is happening, quietly, invisibly, and dangerously. Because every time you tell yourself, "I'm just lazy," and move on, a part of you forgets to question. A part of you accepts the label, internalizes it. Studies show that the human brain craves dopaminergic alignment, the matching of effort with meaningful reward. When your actions align with deeply held values, your brain releases dopamine in sustainable, nourishing patterns. But when you chase extrinsic rewards, likes, status, validation, you get short-term dopamine spikes followed by deep crashes. Your motivation system burns out. Your sense of self erodes. And what do we call the aftermath? Burnout, fatigue, laziness. But in truth, it's misfired longing. Your mind is starving for meaningful connection. Your spirit is choking on performance. Your body is screaming, "I can't keep doing this." And society's response? Try harder. This is how entire lives are lost. Not to tragedy, not to failure, but to unconscious agreement with smallness. You were not born to be efficient. You were born to be alive. But if you keep confusing confusion for character flaws, you'll keep medicating symptoms while ignoring the illness. So what's the cost of staying here, in this fog? A life where your inner fire flickers, but never burns. Where your days are full, but your soul is empty. Where your actions are correct, but your essence is lost. And one day, you'll look back and wonder, not why you were lazy, but why you didn't question sooner. But here's the miracle. It's not too late. Because now you've seen the fracture. You've named the fog. You've begun to unlearn the lie. And the next step? Rebellion. A rebellion not of rage, but of remembrance. Of reclaiming what was stolen. Of rewriting the map. That's what comes next. Shall we begin? Wears it like skin. And over time, the accusation becomes identity. You no longer say, "I feel lost." You say, "I'm just not good at life." That's how the slow rot begins, not in grand, dramatic moments, but in subtle agreements made with despair. And while the world applauds busyness and punishes introspection, you become a ghost in your own life. This is the first unseen consequence, the erosion of self-trust. When you repeatedly fail to act, not because you're unwilling, but because you can't feel a compelling why, you begin to distrust your own impulses. You treat your fatigue as evidence of failure. You treat your confusion as proof of incompetence. And over time, you no longer ask, "What do I want?" You only ask, "What do I need to do to be acceptable?" Eventually, that distrust becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You stop listening to your intuition. You stop following your curiosity. You stop risking joy. You become what philosopher Erich Fromm described as a functioning automaton, alive, but not living. And here's the second consequence, emotional numbing. Because when the inner compass is broken and you continue to walk, something inside you shuts down to survive. It's not depression in the clinical sense. It's a subtle detachment, a disconnection from your emotions, not because you're weak, but because feeling too deeply in a meaningless context is unbearable. So you learn to live on the surface. You perform small talk, not real conversation. You celebrate achievements you don't actually care about. You scroll, you binge, you distract, but you no longer feel wonder, or hunger, or awe. This is the invisible trade. You lose the agony of questioning, and with it, the ecstasy of becoming. The third consequence? Learned helplessness. A concept first identified by psychologist Martin Seligman. It happens when a person is exposed to repeated stress or failure in a situation they feel powerless to change. Over time, they stop trying, even when escape becomes possible. Now translate that to modern life. How many people spend years in jobs they despise, convinced they have no other choice? How many artists gave up before they began, because their dreams were unrealistic? How many of your ideas died in the space between inspiration and action, not because they were impossible, but because you no longer believed your desires mattered? Learned helplessness makes you believe your cage is part of the architecture of reality. It whispers, "Why try? It won't change anything." And the cruel irony? You may still look functional on the outside. You go to work, you meet deadlines, you reply to emails. But inside, you are slowly surrendering your agency. That's how false identities take hold. You become the reliable one, the responsible one, the person who never complains. And yet, underneath it all, there's a different self, trapped, screaming, buried. The one who wanted more, the one who used to dream, question, create, dare. Every day that passes in silence is not neutral. It's another layer of dust over that voice. But here's the most devastating consequence of all. You forget you ever had a choice. You forget that life is not about fitting into systems, but about transcending them. You forget that purpose is not given, it is forged, painfully and personally. You forget that laziness was never the enemy. It was the signal. A signal that your current life does not match your deeper self. A signal that you've been chasing shadows instead of substance. A signal that you are not broken, but misaligned. And because no one told you that, you internalized the blame. This is where neuroscience comes in. You don't fix this by downloading another productivity app. You don't cure it by forcing yourself through another morning routine you secretly resent. You don't overcome it by whispering motivational quotes to a soul that's drowning. No, you start with something far more dangerous, far more sacred. You begin with rebellion. Not rebellion in the dramatic, burning bridges, throw everything away sense, but rebellion in the truest, quietest, most transformative form, choosing to listen again. They were pulled by something unseen. Van Gogh didn't wake up at 6 a.m. and follow a 10-step plan to greatness. He followed the ache. He followed the trembling. He followed the color and the sorrow until it poured out of his brush. This is the second layer of rebellion. Let your longing lead, not your fear, not your guilt, not your to-do list. But the deeper knowing that something inside you has been waiting for permission to burn again. And when you do this, not once, but consistently, something begins to shift. You no longer dread your mornings. You no longer postpone your life. You no longer look at yourself as a broken machine. You begin to see that the very part of you were told to fight, your restlessness, your stillness, your so-called laziness, was never the enemy. It was the compass, and it was pointing you home. The world may not celebrate your rebellion. There won't be a parade. You may even lose things: approval, certainty, predictability. But what you'll gain is yourself. And that is a price worth paying. Because you cannot be fully alive while abandoning yourself. You cannot be truly motivated while chasing goals that betray your core. You cannot find joy by erasing your pain. But you can rebuild, brick by brick, breath by breath. And that's what we'll do now. Because the final piece of this journey is not strategy, but truth, not methods, but meaning. In the last part, we go deeper. To the root, to the revelation, to the ultimate truth that changes everything. Ready? Because the most radical thing you can do in a system that demands you perform is to pause and remember who you are. Start here. What parts of you have been sleeping, not because they were lazy, but because the world offered no place for them to wake up? What dreams did you bury under the labels of unrealistic, childish, too late, too risky? What questions have you silenced to keep the peace with a life that never fit you? This is your rebellion, not in breaking things, but in rebuilding your relationship to meaning. Begin by choosing stillness, not as avoidance, but as inquiry. Instead of fighting your lack of motivation, sit with it. Ask it what it's trying to say. What is the part of you that can't get out of bed morning? What does it know that your calendar doesn't? Because when you stop labeling yourself as broken, you create space to listen. And in that listening, you may hear a whisper, faint at first, but real. There is something more, something truer, something that once made your heart ache with wonder. And the first act of rebellion? Trust that voice. Even if it sounds irrational, even if it scares you, even if it contradicts everything you were taught. You must understand, the systems around you were not designed with your soul in mind. They were designed for efficiency, for conformity, for predictability. But your soul is none of those things. Your soul is wild. It is contradictory. It is poetic. It doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in cycles. It doesn't crave discipline. It craves direction. And so, your rebellion must be creative. Build a life around questions, not just answers. Choose curiosity over competence. Make art without permission. Take walks without destinations. Let silence be your teacher. This is not romantic idealism, it is existential survival. Because when you reintroduce mystery, beauty, and autonomy into your life, you awaken the part of you that longs to move again. Not from pressure, but from longing. Here's what people get wrong about rebellion. They think it has to be loud, but the loudest changes rarely last. True transformation is often invisible at first. It begins the moment you stop measuring yourself by how useful you are to systems that never loved you. It begins when you take your foot off the gas pedal of expectations and ask, where was I even going? It begins when you stop trying to be productive and start trying to be alive. Take Viktor Frankl, for example. In the horrors of the Holocaust, stripped of identity, safety, and even his family, he found a deeper truth, that even in suffering, if one has meaning, one can endure. He called this the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. You may not be in a concentration camp, but you may be living in a psychological one, and the door is unlocked. You just have to choose to walk out. And it starts with one radical act: redefine what matters. Maybe your rebellion is writing poetry again. Maybe it's switching careers at 40. Maybe it's telling the truth in a relationship you've been shrinking yourself to survive. Maybe it's starting therapy, painting, praying, breathing, questioning, anything that reclaims your voice. And when the old voices return, the ones that say you're lazy, ungrateful, irresponsible, pause and ask them, by whose definition? Because here's the truth. Many of the people you were taught to admire weren't disciplined in the traditional sense. They were obsessed. They were haunted. Here it is. The moment you've been circling. The moment beneath all the questions, the fog, the ache. The moment you stop asking what's wrong with you and start asking what happened to you. You were never lazy. You were never broken. You were never missing discipline or lacking potential. You were simply taught to abandon yourself. And now, the ultimate truth rises like a tide that cannot be pushed back. You do not need to be fixed. You need to be found. You're listening. You're feeling. You're returning. And that is where everything begins. Somewhere along the path, you traded your being for doing. You measured yourself in deadlines met, in hours worked, in praise received. You learned to function in systems that reward output, but punish authenticity. And in doing so, you became a stranger to your own soul. That is the wound. That is the source of the fog, the fatigue, the paralysis. And the most powerful realization? That your stillness, your laziness, was never the sickness. It was the signal. A signal that the version of life handed to you was too small, too shallow, too quiet for the roar of your inner world. It wasn't your fault that you followed the script. You were praised for it, promoted for it, loved for it even. But there comes a moment in every awake person's life where the applause starts to feel hollow, where the well-done smile no longer warms your chest, where the mirror asks, not how successful you are, but how honest. And here's the unbearable paradox. You can achieve everything the world told you to chase, and still feel empty. You can be envied, admired, even imitated, and still feel lost. Because meaning isn't found in perfection. It's found in alignment. This is the truth no one told you. Your soul has a shape, a language, a rhythm, a story that only you can hear. When you betray that shape, when you take on jobs, relationships, personas that do not fit, you bleed energy. You appear lazy. You act unmotivated. But you're not. You're grieving. You're disconnected. You are a violin playing jazz in a punk band. Loud, but not alive. Carl Jung called this phenomenon individuation, the process of becoming your true self by integrating the forgotten, buried, repressed parts of you. He believed that most modern suffering comes from the refusal to walk that path, from living as a mask. And so the final revelation is this: your task is not to become more efficient. Your task is to become whole. That means reclaiming the parts of you that were shamed into silence. The dreamer, the artist, the rebel, the child, the lover, the wanderer, the one who cried too easily, the one who questioned too much, the one who refused to follow the rules that made no sense. They were never the problem. They were the map. And so, in your stillness, in your fog, in your so-called laziness, there is an invitation, not to do more, but to return. Return to what you loved before anyone told you what was valuable. Return to the voice that said, "This isn't it." Return to the small, flickering flame in your chest that never went out, only dimmed under the weight of performance. This return is not easy. It will cost you comfort. It will ask you to disappoint people. It will tear down every illusion you built to stay safe. But on the other side, freedom. Not the freedom of doing whatever you want, but the freedom of no longer betraying who you are. This is the truth that cracks the world open. The opposite of laziness is not productivity. The opposite of laziness is presence. It's the state of being so aligned, so moved, so here, that effort becomes a byproduct of love. You move, not because you must, but because you cannot not. You rise, not for the checklist, but for the calling. And the final irony? Once you stop trying to force motivation, it returns. Once you stop shaming yourself into action, you move, not to escape yourself, but to express yourself. This is what it means to wake up, not to a busier life, but to a truer one built not on should, but on soul, one measured not by output, but by aliveness, one that asks not, "What did you achieve today?" but, "Did you remember who you are?" So let the world say what it will. Let it call your rest laziness. Let it mock your stillness. Let it demand your hustle. You know the truth now. You're not lazy. You were lost, but you're not lost anymore.